we're sitting here. We just talked about Doug Block a little bit before we turn on the mics because he's going to also his first film is finally going to be available on streaming on demand. And
what year was that made? Homepage?
Well, it's the 20th anniversary, so I think 2000. I think it came out in '98. I think that's
that makes sense.
But I could be off on my dates. I know it's kind of strange because it seems like his second film was 51 Birch. So yeah, I met him after that. Yeah. Anyhow, who cares about him? And it's nice to kind of go there right after this and have immerse myself in the documentaries for the afternoon.
Yeah, that sounds like a good day to me. Yeah.
Your documentary is called Charm City, and I'm trying to recall where I saw it. So tell me before we talk about its broadcast premiere, which is coming up next week, tell me at the festivals, because I'm trying to recall where I saw it.
We premiered at Tribeca in 2018.
Okay, so that could be it.
And then I don't remember the exact run. We then had our hometown premiere at the Maryland Film Festival the following week in May.
Okay, I was there.
Okay.
I was at the Maryland
Film Festival. That was a good screening.
So we may have actually met.
Maybe we did. It was a good screening. 3 sold-out giant houses and a lot of enthusiasm. That was probably my scariest
It's a good
screening.
festival, too.
It's a great festival.
Looking forward to going
Jed
back.
Dietz is now retiring.
Yeah.
Scott
They're
Braid.
undergone a lot of change in the last year or so.
They were a good festival to me. They really treated us well. And then we ultimately, we did our theatrical premiere at the Parkway, which is affiliated with the festival.
Yes, right. It all makes sense that, you'd be doing that because the documentary is about the community in Baltimore. Just to create a scenario for you and some context, I grew up in New York City in the 70s. It was kind of rough and tumble.
Yep.
You did?
Yep.
You grew up in Manhattan?
Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn. I grew up in Queens, so we kind of shared this borough thing. I moved into Manhattan myself. But I grew up in a time where I was just at the Public Theater this weekend and ran into an old friend of mine who I grew up with, in fact, just coincidentally. And we were talking about how I said, my parents belonged to the Public Theater when I was growing up, and they would go, park their car. They'd drive in from Queens, park their car in, on what was called the Bowery.
Right.
And hope that when they left the play and got back to the car, it would be there.
Right.
Because it was kind of it was
rough. Yeah.
It was rough. Union Square was a needle park. I mean, it was not anything remotely.
The squeegee guys used to jump up on the hood of your car and pee on your windshield if you wouldn't let them do their squeegee work.
Right. Oh, I thought you were going to say that was their
No, it was not
cleanser.
the liquid. It was only if you didn't let them.
Well, my point being is New York was a rough place to grow up.
It was.
And I've gotten close. I've never been successfully mugged in my day. I've seen a lot of incidents of racial tension. I've seen a lot of incidents with cops and with citizens, and I've heard a lot of things. I was here when the Central Park 5 occurred. So I'm not naive, I guess. So a couple of years ago, I started going to the Maryland Film Festival, which we were just talking about, and I showed up in Baltimore, and I have to say, I was shocked. I really was not prepared for that experience.
Yeah, the blight.
The blight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a city built for 1 million, and then like most major urban centers, jobs left, manufacturing left, shipping left, and then crime came in, and that overlaid with crack coming in, and even though heroin is really the drug of choice in Baltimore, and folks just started leaving for the suburbs, and so this city built for 1 million now houses only 620,000, give or take, at any given year, and what you see is everything that remains. Entire blocks that are boarded, and a city that lost its tax base, so can't really do the investment itself, and relies on community developers to come in and do that work. Unlike New York, where there's a lack of transportation too, so folks can't kind of get around the same way. In New York, there's always work. There's some industry here. If it's not the last one, it's a new one, and we have a way of reviving places, but that is just not the case in Baltimore.
Yeah, I was in a car. I was in a taxi or what have you the last time I was there, and the taxi driver said, there are more car accidents in Baltimore per capita.
Really?
I don't know if he's right, but I'm just quoting him. I'm just paraphrasing. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. I said, what do you owe that to? And he said, it's that there's so much stress living here for some people. I don't mean to generalize too much or paint too drastic a situation, but it's that he says, it's just that there's a lot of stress. It's hard when you're stressed to focus, and people just are not being careful. They're not focused enough, and they're not being defensive enough.
Well, I think, what is true, and that's part of the title of the film, Charm City was a 1970s nickname given to the city by itself to try to lure back folks.
So it was an attempt at branding.
It was an attempt at branding.
Before they called it that.
And what we found when we were filming is that depending where you lived, and Baltimore is a pretty segregated city, and so depending where you lived, if you were in the white, more affluent neighborhoods, you think of it as Charm City. That stress you described is likely not theirs. And then if you're in the poorer, predominantly African-American communities, they call it Harm City. And where life is rough and it's hard to get by and the basic resources are not being met. And that was, if you watch the film and you see the title, we actually have the C flicker on that title so that we're kind of nodding to the locals. We understand what's in play here.
Oh, I see.
We don't believe it's all Charm City all the time. And why is it that a major American city can have two completely disparate experiences depending on your race or your economic status?
And what is the answer to that question? This film, it's called Charm City. It explores this in a verite observational way. I don't think it's not a polemical film. It's just right there. There is a feeling that black people or people of color are just dispensable, that they don't have as much value.
Well, it's an interesting city too, and one of the reasons we went down there is because, when we were looking and we wanted to explore the divide between police and citizens and to understand what wasn't working. And Baltimore was interesting because the majority of the city is African American.
That's right.
So it's not universally true that people of color are dispensed with there. The majority of the city council is African American at the time when we started. The mayor, the police commissioner, African American. They had at the time that we started, they had the largest plurality of African American officers in the country.
Okay, so it's more even complex, right? So, of course, in a city where there is an enormous majority of people of color, that will also be reflected in. But there's an incredibly high murder rate.
Yeah, so what you're really looking at is an economic disparity.
I should say murder rate because
both a lot of people overdose death and
incidental
death. Yes, but what you're really looking at is an economic disparity, and that actually is a direct correlation to violence.
Yeah.
And so though we started to understand what was the divide between police and citizens and what is the day-to-day experience of those who feel excessively policed and the police, we landed in Baltimore during the 3 most violent years in recent history. And I don't think that was coincidental. I think we saw it was sort of a, you pay the piper, like the payment came due. So if you go through zero tolerance policing 20 years earlier and you separate families and you send breadwinners to prison and they now are all re-entering and trying to get back into society, poverty, desperation, hopelessness, a lack of investment in these communities, a lack of infrastructure in these communities, blight, unemployment, all of those things make for a stressful life. And when life is stressful, I think people are not able to make their best choices, and so you do wind up with higher rates of violence. And then what we saw is that police are sent in to deal with what really are social problems, to deal with them as criminal justice problems.
Right. People that don't have the tools to deal with stress in
they're not social workers
in their daily lives.
They're often young men who are trained to be police officers. And can police officers do a better job of training so that, since the police are first responders, they're often first on the scene for things that don't require criminal justice intervention. They just require intervention. And could we train police better to get things to the right department? Yes. But until we do, we're sending in the police to deal with social problems, as opposed to criminal justice problems. And I think that is where we see this collision and why we see the cycles just perpetuate. So we send police in to deal with social problems. Their tools are handcuffs, tasers, and guns. People wind up back in prison, and we just create the cycle again. Another family lost their father, husband, brother. Into prison they go. Have single family units trying to deal with all the stresses that come with being poor in a city that's disinvested. So, I think for us, what we understood in making that film is really most of these issues, violence is really a public health crisis and should be treated as a public health crisis is. Not with law enforcement, though they could be helpful, but with resources and investment in community, in reading, in having kids meet grade level, in education, in employment, in training. But that's a hard thing to do when you have a city that's dealing with such a high murder rate. How do you pivot those resources?
Hemorrhaging on some, with that.
Yeah. And the largest share of the budget goes to the police, and that feels understandable because how do you respond by taking money from police who are already strapped? Baltimore has a city of police officers that don't have a lot of resources. They didn't have computers in their car when we were down there. They drove solo because there weren't enough officers to patrol.
Yeah, right. Which is, I hear, of course, to have some. It sounds obvious you want to have two people in a car, you have somebody who is your backup. But it's actually even more so when you arrive at a scene of crime, your adrenaline is pumping, and you're more likely to make a bad choice, or maybe not use the best option first.
Or you're dealing with this very present thing over here, but who's dealing with the conflict on the other side, right? Like, if something's heated.
Well, if you have a domestic issue going on, and there's two people involved, you want to have both people being talked off the ledges, so to speak. Yep. But I was thinking, when you get there and you're and somebody, you feel threatened as a police officer, usually does when they arrive, and somebody looks menacing, or they perceive somebody as being menacing,
bias,
that they may reach for that weapon, the taser, the gun, whatever it is, a little too soon without going through.
Right, because once adrenaline gets pumping, you're in a bit of fight or
That's
flight.
Right. Yeah.
I remember when we first started this film, and you just do an endless amount of research to get yourself situated. Where are we before we bring our cameras to a place? And actually, I was listening to a podcast that described...
Wait a minute. What?
that described a police shooting in New York, but it was the shooting of a dog. And there was surveillance cameras, I guess, in the hallway. There were 4 doorways. The police officer was coming up the stairs. There was a call for domestic violence complaint. There was shouting. He could hear it. His adrenaline was pumping.
Right.
And as would happen, right, neighbors are hearing it too. Someone opened their door to see what was happening.
Sure.
The dog ran out. The police officer who was there to deal with this domestic violence thing has 4 doors. Right. So he doesn't know which way danger will come from.
Right.
Door opens, a dog runs out, he shot the dog, which is tragic. You hear about these things and people are like, he shot my dog. That's a horrifying thing. I took a minute to say, but what does a police officer do in that moment when there's 2 doors behind him and 2 doors in front of him, and he's supposed to be responding to danger?
Yeah.
I had a hard time. I would like training to be different, but in the real world of what it means to be a human being, how do we react? So that was the premise of the film, to go bring our cameras to a place and just see what it means to be you for the day, to be Alex Long, who is living in a neighborhood with a too high homicide rate, and he's trying to change that equation.
This is one of your 4? How many people are you following?
I
mean, the most
6 main subjects in the film. Yeah,
and it's
a couple
not as
on
sprawling
community.
as you may think. Even with 6 people,
right.
It's fairly.
We're in one neighborhood on the community side with a young man and his mentor, Mr.
Right.
C, who's
Mr.
been
C is one of the 6 you're counting.
One of the
I assume,
6,
right?
yeah.
Okay, so
and then
you have 6 characters.
6 characters, 3 police officers,
right?
That are also patrolling in one district in particular,
and an assemblyman.
And then a councilman.
Councilman, excuse me.
Yeah,
Councilman.
So that's our 6.
Who's a very young person, but extremely intelligent and wise, and
believes that violence is a public health disease.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the words he uses, and he's invited onto radio shows, and we're invited to watch him call into the radio shows, and it's great because you see the people that are representing Baltimore. And they take you into the neighborhood, and you see that they're all wants Baltimore to
thrive.
Yeah.
Everybody that we named, but for one police officer, everyone is a native from Baltimore.
Yeah.
And so they know their city. And part of what we did when we figured out who to profile in the film, or to point our cameras to and to follow for 3 years, was trying to find folks who if you listen to reformers, they say we need police from the community. Well, these police were from that community. We need people to be responsible in their own neighborhoods to help prevent violence. Well, there are people doing that. And so the calls for change, I didn't know, but I think we found over time, didn't necessarily represent who's literally standing on the ground.
Right. It's also, we know the problem. We actually even at this point know the solution. Now, how do we go about,
right,
putting it into place?
Right. How do you turn the Titanic, as it were? It's a big thing to change a city.
It requires an investment.
Yeah. And I hope what we profile in the end is hope that there are folks on the ground who are trying. I think it's not to say these problems aren't enormous. They should not be handled by citizens alone or patrol officers alone, but that there are people who care every day and go out and do their job every day trying to change the equation. And that it's not, I think we look at city government. Baltimore is now in its 5th police commissioner and 3rd mayor since we started the film just 4 years ago. You look at that and you just think it's systemic blight. It's just broken. But there are people trying. We're just sort of looking at leadership in the wrong direction. We got to look to the folks who are doing it every day, not just at the top where there's politics.
So the film, which again is called Charm City and it's directed by Marilyn Ness, it's going to be having its TV broadcast premiere
on Independent Lens, April 22nd, Monday.
April 22nd, Monday at, do we know that?
Well, in New York, it's 10 p.m., but check your local listings.
Check your local listings if there is such a thing anymore. But no, obviously, depending on where you are in the country.
CharmCityDoc.com. Actually, we have a link to help you find your local listing.
Oh, very good. So it's CharmCityDoc.com is the website, and you're on Twitter and...
and Facebook and
whatever.
I think those ones. Yeah,
that should be sufficient. What did all your subjects? What and the people that you invited? I'm sure you had friends and family screenings, or they came to everybody showed up at the Maryland Film Festival. Of course,
between Tribeca and Maryland. Yeah, right. It was pretty.
What did they make of it? How did they feel the city was represented?
The city likes the film, which surprised me. Because it's rough. But I think they felt it was
warts and all, right?
Warts and all. It was an honest portrayal. I think they have often felt that they have been maligned and misrepresented. Yeah, that there isn't a lot of heart.
You're not showing that they're at that side of their city, but it does. You do see a lot of pride in. I remember seeing in the film. I've seen it twice.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. I think the folks that stay are really committed to their city.
Yeah,
they won't go anywhere. They won't leave. They might complain about it, but they won't leave. Mm-hmm. And so you have to wonder what keeps folks there when life is hard. And I think there's a real commitment. Yeah, it's home. The roots are deep.
Yeah, right.
Lots of neighborhood pride. People don't leave their neighborhoods. If you're an East Baltimorean, you've always been an East Baltimorean. Your high school matters.
You brought up Mr. C, whose name is actually
Clayton Guyton.
Guyton. I was trying to figure out how to pronounce because I did want to talk about him. He's a fixture on the block, and he has he's I guess leads this group. I don't think it's a youth group. It's a community.
It's a community center, Rose Street Community Center.
Right, and a lot of the town meetings take place just outside on the sidewalk, and young men from the neighborhood, mostly young men, I should say young women as well, gather every morning
at 8 a.m.
At 8 a.m. He holds court, but and it's a combination. Update sermons.
He's a guiding principle. He's a guiding force, and he's also social services. So these guys come to the meeting at 8 a.m. and get their sort of word from Mr. C for the morning. They get $2 in bus fare, which just goes to show you what it takes. That's what folks need.
Yeah,
and then he's a hub for social services. Yeah. So if somebody needs help because they need their birth certificate or they need something to do with all the practical stuff that you'd have to navigate city agencies. But the kids
he also
who
provides a shoulder.
He does.
Because it's clear that people are struggling and the stress gets to them.
And they're not sure. There's not necessarily family units. They don't necessarily know where to go.
There's not enough work. So some of these people are either unemployed or underemployed.
Right.
The draw of how to make quick money is all too present.
Right.
As you
said. And
so
he'll mention job listings. He'll send kids for job training. He sends folks for counseling. I mean, he really does kind of provide it all. The reason we actually chose to film with him, we started filming in a whole bunch of community centers, but I visited a lot of them with Mariam Boisjemi. She was our local co-producer in Baltimore who like really was a cheerleader for her city. And, you know, so we were seeing it through the lens of locals. But Mariam and I went to Mr. C one morning. We had heard about him. He invited us to come after morning meeting. So the whole throng of guys is out front. We don't really know what's happening. We go in, we sit down. He has an easy chair that he sits in. We sit in 2 chairs and we begin to have a conversation. And all of a sudden we heard a kerfuffle outside. A kid walks in, takes one look at Mr. C sitting with us, and Mr. C's like, "You okay?" And the kid's like, I'm okay. And he doesn't want to interrupt. And Mr. C says, "No, are you okay?" And the kid goes off. He's like, "No, I'm not okay." He's like, "I was basically up at the corner store and Shorty disrespected me, and if he doesn't stop, I'm going to pop him." But the kid walked himself a block and a half from the corner store
doing
to Mr.
exactly
C.
what we were saying the cop doesn't do, can't
or
do.
Like,
He doesn't have
who is the prevent?
Right,
Mr.
right.
C always
That's
said.
why it's good to have that second person in the car is my point. Because,
Totally.
Yeah, anyway, go ahead.
But even then, Mr.
Sure.
C always said, police are first responders.
Yeah.
Community are preventers.
Yeah.
They are the ones that need to keep the peace so the police don't have to come. And Alex Long says that all the time. He's Mr. C's disciple and becomes a violence interrupter himself formally for an organization called Safe Streets in Baltimore that tries to reduce gun violence. Yeah. And Mr. C and Alex would always say that their job, if they do their job right, the police, they never need the police. The police never need come, right? That they can be the ones that can help keep their neighborhood safe. And we don't have to have all these problems with police, these bad interactions of the overly policed communities. Right. And I think that there's truth to that. But I think what we found in the film is, and what was really striking, we stood for 3 years filming on both quote unquote sides of the divide. And we would hear the same thing on both sides: frustration with the violence, frustration with the escalating murder rate. And everyone was saying the same thing. Everyone wanted the same thing. They just would never talk to each other. Right. Because of, how distrust is bred when you use zero tolerance to arrest the majority of young men in Baltimore, young black men in Baltimore. So really what we found was just this gaping divide and a lack of ability to reach one another, even if your goals were the same. And we don't offer solutions, right? The film is really just a lens to look at this differently than we see in cataclysmic moments on the nightly news, just 30-second bites. It's a way to be deep and thoughtful and present for a long period of time to show there's more commonality than difference. How do we get folks on the same page? And I think that's what Baltimore actually, when the people who know this and live it every day, whether you're a police officer or community member, felt like this was an honest portrayal of their lives, and they felt seen and heard. And so we went about, once the film was released, doing an impact campaign in Baltimore where the film was screened more than 75 times for more than 4,000 audiences. And you really begin to see them start to see one another differently than they had. Of course, it takes ongoing work to build those bridges then, but the ability to see someone you have considered the enemy as human is, I think, a novelty in this day and age. And the film is effective in doing that.
It is, yeah. And it'll have its broadcast premiere, which is a big deal for a documentary, right?
It is. It's lovely to have
television is
national distribution.
Means a few people.
It means millions of people will watch, which was important to us. That this film that feels
a good portion of Baltimore,
Yes. This film that feels sort of seminal to our national discourse will be seen on national public television. And also Independent Lens put some effort behind it, and we're part of something called Indie Lens Pop-Up. So there have been 60 in-person events around the country with the film in all different cities, Albuquerque and St. Louis and everywhere.
So you can't get to all those, obviously. Are they the community just, I guess they give the people that are hosting it the tools to figure out how to run such a thing and do a Q&A and
we help create a really robust discussion guide that framed
points,
how to look at things. It's like 40 pages long. It's really in depth. It's available on charmcitydoc.com.
If you are interested
and PBS.
in even though it's coming on television, what you don't get from TV, even though the benefits are outweigh the alternatives, but doing a community screening is a great thing regardless, because you get to have the conversation afterwards, and you can really have you can walk out a somewhat different person than when you walked in.
I think so. Yeah, I think the discussion guide, if you even read it, if you're looking to put your thoughts somewhere after you see the film, because I think it really does sit with you. We've heard that people take these subjects with them in their day-to-day life. The discussion guide gives you a way to frame your thinking, to understand.
And I can tell you firsthand, those listening, because I usually, if there's a long period of time between me seeing the film and then talking to the filmmaker, I do try to see it, but sometimes I can just it comes back to me and I'll just skip through. But this time, the moment I started watching, I was drawn right back into it. It's a very intense but rewarding watch.
Thank you.
I'm going to recommend people to take a look at it on Independent Lens. All you need is cable. For God's sake. No, you don't even need that.
Maybe rabbit ears.
Maybe just rabbit ears, if you know what that is, if you're listening.
If you're not from 1970s.
40 years.
Yeah.
Or older.
We established that. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, Marilyn.
Thank you for having me.
I wish you nothing but the best, and we'll do this again with your next project. Producer or director, you're invited back.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure.